Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to welcome our colleagues from the University of Toronto's Centre for Teaching Support and Innovation for our SoTL Speaker Series session today. Okay, a tongue twister. I'll introduce them quickly before passing things over to them. Mike Kasprzak is an educational developer, instructional designer, and teacher with over 20 years of experience in higher education. And currently, he is assistant director at the CTSI and works closely with graduate students and faculty, exploring topics such as teaching presence in online learning, the intersection of UDL and decolonization, and much more. And Sam Chang is an art historian by day, classical musician by night, and an educator always. I took that word for word because I love it. Currently, she is an educational developer at the CTSI with a focus on teaching, learning, and technology, as well as an instructor in the Department of Art History at U of T. And she integrates and supports others in integrating critical and inclusive pedagogies, accessible design, and UDL. So I'm keeping it brief because they've got a lot of awesome things to share with us today about universal design for learning for evidence-informed curricular change. So welcome. Thanks everyone for joining. And without further ado, Mike and Sam.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, folks, for the invite to come and talk to you about UDL. Sam and I have been UDLizing, not sure how to frame that for a number, my goodness, for a number of years. Probably for cumulatively for like probably 20, 30 years now, which is extensive. So going through all the various iterations of the UDL guidelines. And I was glad to hear that you've already have started engaging in this conversation around UDL. And so today, what we want to do is many, many things, but we want to continue that conversation of thinking about UDL as a design lens, right? And this isn't about this kind of checkbox approach of like checking things in, but rather thinking intentionally how UDL can be used as a way to think about a range of different design approaches to curriculum change, and that curriculum change at various levels, right? In at the micro level, in the context of courses, all the way to that sort of meso through that program level, and then macro at that institutional level transformation, right? And we're not, and here is like a big, the small print, the fine print that we want to emphasize that even though we're going to talk about curricular change, right? We also emphasize, and you'll see us repeating this again and again and again, is that UDL allows not just for a flexibility of different approaches and gateways into that work, but also to think about it not just like, oh my goodness, unless I'm transforming everything in my teaching, it's not impactful. No, we're talking also about like small changes that can have tremendous impact in your teaching, and that's what our aim is for today. So as we always start our sessions with an access check, because we do understand access as a shared responsibility between all of us in the space. And this is not about getting anybody to disclose any kind of disability or a need for accommodation, but rather for all of us to be able to participate fully in all of the conversations. And so Jenny already brilliantly shared the slide deck with folks in the chat, so feel free to download it and follow along. Please take breaks as needed. You know yourself best, and so feel free to step away, stretch, whatever keeps you going for this hour. And then obviously participate in ways that feel comfortable to you. You can use the audio. You can put your hand up and we'll get you to use audio. You can use the chat. You can write your own notes, or you can just sit back and listen to what Sam and I have to say about UDL. And of course, any kind of accommodation is a standing offer, so feel free to reach out to us, to Jenny, if you have any specific needs. And we also start all of our sessions with a land acknowledgement, and this is the formal one from the University of Toronto, and I'll just read it for all of us. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and today this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land. And it's I always love to sort of start this conversation with a land acknowledgement because we bring so many amazing Indigenous ways of knowing into UDL conversations. I always want to emphasize in the context of UDL the emphasis on relationality, and hopefully through that lens, please don't think of this as one of conversations. If you are interested in UDL, don't hesitate to reach out to me and Sam. We always welcome any and all UDL conversations. We'll share our emails are on the very last slide. So feel free to reach out to us. On the right-hand side of the slide, you will see an image of the Zibbing just outside of Hart House at the University of Toronto, very close to King's Circle, so that heart of the university, which was built a few years back as that dedicated Indigenous space for ceremony, celebration, and education. And of course, we want to check about how folks are doing right now. So please take a moment to notice how you're arriving in this space today. And we have a whole spectrum of perspectives. 1, focused and attentive. 2, tired and reflective. 3, energized and ready. 4, stretched and contemplative. And then 5, questioning and curious. So certainly this is not about getting anybody to disclose how they're doing. I am personally a combination of 3 and 1, I would say, is my combination. Sam, I don't know how you're doing this this afternoon.
Am I allowed to pick them all?
Yes, you can. Listen, yes, you can. It could be a whole combination of emotions and states in all of this. Awesome, thanks. But just wanted to do that quick check-in. Of course, we're at lunchtime, so if folks want to snack away on things, please do so. And then finally, the agenda for today. We'll certainly offer our own perspective and definition of universal design for learning. As educational developers in higher education, we always, for years now, have been talking about what are a range of different pathways into UDL in higher education. And so we're going to offer definitions and a range of different pathways. Secondly, this is a conversation about evidence-informed curricular change through SoTL, meaning that you'll see us integrating SoTL conversations, so scholarship of teaching and learning, into ways that you can leverage UDL to reflect on, identify, and share the impact of your UDL interventions, small and big, right? And this is again what I want to emphasize: small and big changes are important. And so what we're going to do is apply UDL and all these and 3 specific gateways into UDL through those 3 levels that I mentioned: micro, meso, and macro. So again, micro in the context of individual learning experiences, typically in a module, in a course; meso at the program level; and then macro, meaning institution-wide. And then if you take nothing else away from today, it's trying one thing. Right, so we're going to emphasize this +1 or -1, meaning +1, what's a small intervention? What's something that you can add that could have impact on student learning? And then -1, meaning what is one complexity, barrier, something that perhaps creates cognitive overload in students? What's one thing that perhaps we can remove? So that +1 and -1. And we'll start off with definitions. So, Sam, take it away.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Yorkville team for inviting us. We're really excited to start with the Universal Design for Learning definition because there have been books upon books written about this topic. There are so many variations of the definition. So here's the one that we've worked on for the past couple of years that's really resonated with some instructors and staff. And so Universal Design for Learning is a proactive and intentional design approach that reduces learning barriers and welcomes learner variability. So it's proactive and intentional. We're not leaving anything to chance. We're talking about planning for that variability from the start, not retrofitting, and really invites us to think carefully about the decisions we're making in our design. And from a SoTL perspective, this is incredibly important because design decisions are not neutral. Right. So they produce patterns of engagement and performance, and UDL helps us make those design decisions visible and therefore examinable. Second, about reducing learning barriers. Barriers are not only physical or technical, they can be cognitive, social, emotional, relational, temporal, structural, and they often occur unintentionally through design decisions, right? So here we're using UDL as a way to invite us to ask, well, which barriers are essential to maintaining academic rigor and which are accidental consequences of how something was designed? And lastly, thinking about the learner variability. Learner variability is the norm, right? We all come to this space with different experiences, confidence, professional background, personal experiences, life context. And so variability is not the exception, it is the norm. So especially in programs where there's professionally oriented programs, variability is especially visible, right? Because we know that our learners are balancing work, family, academic commitments, personal life. And so designing with variability in mind supports both access and rigor. So again, Universal Design for Learning is a proactive and intentional design approach that reduces learning barriers and welcome learner variability. Now, you may have come across UDL in many different contexts. For example, just last month, Yorkville hosted a session on UDL that talked about the various principles as introduced by the Center for Applied Special Technologies, CAST. But when we get back down to design work, it's really helpful to think about, well, what are the core values? What are the values that's guiding this work? And so if you go through the literature on the development of universal design, and then later for UDL and then instructional universal design. And there's so many variants of this. The core values of accessibility, inclusion, and usability persist, right? So for accessibility, again, we're talking about reducing unnecessary structural or cognitive barriers. It's not about lowering standards, rather it's about making the expectations, the processes clear so that your learners can actually spend their effort on achieving the learning outcomes rather than deciphering like, how do I log on to my learning management system? And it accessibly prompts us to ask, well, where might clarity or lack of clarity be shaping the learner performance? Now, for inclusion, again, this relates back to that definition of learner variability. If learner variability is a norm, then we want to design for inclusion so that we are welcoming learners from different backgrounds and experiences and languages and digital fluencies, right? So designing for inclusion means anticipating for that variability from the start rather than responding to it only when challenges surface. This doesn't mean that design is not iterative, but it does signal that there is that anticipatory step, that we're being proactive and thinking ahead. And then finally, usability invites us to ask a very practical question. Does this design actually work in the context, right? So even well-intentioned learning activities can create friction if, let's say, the instructions are unclear or the timeline collapses, or there's no scaffolding, or digital navigation is confusing, right? So when participation breaks down, it's often a design issue rather than a learner issue. So usability allows us to think about like where's friction accumulating and whether that friction is intentional and necessary for learning, or is it accidental and removable? So thinking about your core values of accessibility, inclusion, and usability. Now, Mike and I love to bust some myths, so we thought it'd be helpful, just a quick myth check of what UDL is not. So oftentimes when we're consulting with faculty members, one of the biggest concerns is that, well, UDL lowers standards. Actually, it doesn't. UDL does not lower rigor or expectation. Instead, it asks us to examine whether there are unnecessary barriers preventing learners from demonstrating competence, right? So if let's say you need learners to demonstrate that they've achieved competency for a specific skill or task, yet they can't find the room where they need to go to demonstrate their competency or access the equipment that they need or find the learning management system portal, right? That is unnecessary barrier that is not part of that demonstration of the achievement of learning outcomes. So from a solid perspective, this distinction is actually very important because we're not studying how to make learning easier. We're examining whether learners are being evaluated on intended outcomes rather than their ability to navigate design friction. And then the second myth we often hear is, well, UDL is only for disability accommodations. So, I don't need to worry about it until I know that there are students with academic accommodations. UDL isn't an accommodations process. Accommodations are individualized and more reactive. UDL is proactive and iterative. The two doesn't cancel each other out. Both are necessary for the best possible teaching and learning environment. But again, we are anticipating variability in advance to support a broader range of learners from the outset. And then finally, UDL only applies to classroom teaching. I don't do classroom. I do clinical. I do performance-based. I do land-based. Well, UDL actually extends beyond a single lesson or lecture. And actually, I would argue UDL originated from the clinical setting. But UDL now, as a design framework, can really inform assignment design, program coherence, assessment frameworks, digital environment design, policy level decisions, even things like how you choose to communicate can be informed by UDL just by thinking like, okay, how do I make my communication decisions proactive and intentional so that it reduces learning barriers and welcome learner availability? So in reality, I'm actually fairly certain that all of you are already engaging in certain aspects of UDL aligned practices. But part of it today is thinking about how do we make that intentional and visible so that you know that, hey, this is actually like a UDL aligned practice. Maybe this is something I will consider to keep doing. So now that we all know exactly what UDL is, it's a proactive, intentional approach that reduces learning barriers and welcome variability. Let's dive into the world of curricular change.
Awesome. So I kept talking about these three levels, right, of micro, meso, and macro. So let's unpack this a little bit in terms of how we can understand those three levels, but then also how we can leverage that lens of inquiry, right? Of thinking like how we can always not just apply changes, but then think about how do we know that intended impact is actually happening. So first of all, micro level, right? So this is at that level of typically of course design, of learning design, could be module design in the context of asynchronous learning. And so this is about those individual learning encounters. What happens at that level of student learning, right? And we can speak in here about assignment and assessment design, that weekly rhythm that happens, right, across the duration of the course. It could be about ways that students participate, right? Ways that students engage with materials that we develop that supports their learning. And this is also certainly about our expectations and how we communicate those expectations to students, as well as how we actually use and leverage feedback for student learning. And so at that micro level, when we think about those inquiry questions, we can think about, where are learners struggling? Where does confusion emerge in that sort of week to week rhythm? what patterns appear in submissions or engagements or lack thereof of students, right? Because ultimately, we can think about those small design adjustments that can respond to those friction moments, right? To those patterns, to those pinch points that we may be noticing in a particular course. Then, of course, we get to that meso level, right? So we start zooming out, right? And we think about what is happening across an entire program, right? And so thinking about that sequence of learning outcomes from course to course, and then how they connect those program level learning outcomes. So that kind of alignment across courses. And we know through course evaluations that students are really great at noticing when there is like misalignment at program level, right? When they see those disconnects between from one course to the next, right? And then that range of assessment, right? That misalignment between learning outcomes and the way that students are being assessed. So this is about ultimately about that coherence also across modalities, right? The ways that we engage students in their learning. And so at that meso level, we can think about those inquiry questions in terms of where are the gaps or redundancies, right, across all of the courses, right? So we might say, well, we hope students will take away that particular skill set. Well, okay, wonderful. Where is that skill set actually being learned across courses? And often you might say, oh my goodness, we're not teaching those particular skills in any of our courses, right? So identifying those gaps. You might ask, are learners receiving consistent signals about standards and supports? Do we engage students in conversations about normalizing supports that students can use across the entire program of study, right? And then thinking ultimately about those structural shifts that could improve coherence or access, that kind of alignment between courses. And then certainly the macro level, right? So this is that sort of institution system-wide thinking around practices, policies, right? Those top level sort of guidelines and policy frameworks that dictate many aspects of teaching and learning, and thinking about something like program review and policy, right? The quality assurance. How do we structure and engage curriculum committees, right, at various levels, and see how that can transform that student learning? How do we leverage things like technology ecosystem, right? Especially that learning management system, right? Is there consistency or inconsistency in how students navigate that kind of learning through learning management systems, right? The accessibility standards, guidelines, and policies, right? How are students accessing accessibility services, right? Those institution-wide supports for students. And then ultimately institutional learning strategies, right? Very often it's like, what's that message that comes down about learning, how learning should be structured, how it should unfold for students. And when we think about curriculum change, of course, it's incredibly complex. Lots of moving parts at every single institution. There are lots of real constraints that shape the extent to which we as course instructors, perhaps as educational leaders, can think about ways that we can implement changes. And I just want to identify sort of 6 areas of constraints. And folks, feel free to share with us if any of these resonate. So this is, again, speaking from our own experience around various things that can constrain the impact we can have. First of all, limited time and competing demands, right? Very often faculty are involved, not just in teaching, right, but in service work, scholarship, administrative constraints, right? There accelerated timelines and formats for courses. All these things certainly impact how much time we can invest in changing those courses, program level, institution level curriculum change. high cognitive load. And this goes for both students, for learners, and for instructors, right? My goodness, folks have probably heard of AI. I think we started the conversation today thinking about artificial intelligence. My goodness, has that increased that level of complexity, right? Around assessment design, engagement, right? All these kinds of things, and thinking about the digital environment writ large. Structural complexities, right? Accelerated curves. My goodness, I remember once upon a time I was teaching at TMU, and we were experimenting with moving 12-week courses into 2 weeks. My goodness, was that quite an experiment, right? But there are many different constraints that are structural, right? Very often we might get directives around modality. We're moving our program from in-person to fully online, or fully online to hybrid, right? And thinking about some of those constraints in that shift in modality. Legacy systems, right? Inherited assessment formats, syllabi, LMS templates, policies, right? All these legacy systems and elements influence and constrain what we're able to do and what we're not able to do. And sometimes it's acknowledging, right, constraints, perhaps not being able to transform them all at once, but thinking about what are small things that we could impact. Influence beyond one instructor, right? So thinking about both the program level, institution level change. And that requires a lot of coordination, often a lot of collaboration, lots of conversations, right? Especially for folks who have been on curriculum committees, right? And thinking about to what extent that teaching at the program level, institution level becomes a team sport. And then finally, diverse learner context, right? We know that students, my goodness, students have to balance work, academics, study. Living in Toronto is not cheap, right? So thinking about a range of commitments that students are facing. And then fronting that variability, right? Because that sort of normalizing variability, engaging in the conversation about variability, and this is why we emphasize it in our definition, is such a key aspect, right? Always thinking about the diversity of students that come into our classrooms. And then finally, and maybe I'll pause here and see if any of these resonate with folks. Just like literally 30 seconds, see if there are if anybody wants to flag anything, if you're like, yes, that makes sense, or it's like, I'm not sure what you're talking about, Mike, right? Let's see what folks are thinking. I'll just give it 30 seconds if folks can also add something in the chat, but I just want to pause here for us to catch our breath, just to see if there are any elements. I know that, I'm not teaching right now, but I know Sam is teaching a large course, and so we always talk about all of these things with Sam. Yes, Teresa writes, innovation is important. Absolutely, right? And that's why in the latter half of our chat today, we're going to talk about like those small innovations that can have tremendous impact. Absolutely. All right, so standing offer, of course, feel free to keep adding. And the last sort of aspect of thinking about the curriculum change is to think about this as truly as design opportunities being those iterative inquiry moments, right? What do we mean by that? Typically, we can think about that sort of connection of like teaching and research, and how we want to make the decisions that we make about changes in our courses to be evidence-based. And I don't mean here evidence-based as, my goodness, I need to do a massive data triangulation. If you're able to, amazing, right? But very often we can just notice things, right? Where is there friction, right? We've mentioned friction, complexity, barrier, right? Something that creates confusion for students. And when we sort of reflect, take a step back and reflect on like the entire course that we are doing, but this can be extrapolated to program level and institution level, we can identify patterns, right, in the barriers and confusions that students face. So noticing is that first step. Then it's the design stage, right? So thinking about ways that we can leverage UDL for those interventions, right? We can think about like, how do we add a small intervention or remove a barrier, right? Then we reach that stage of testing, right? We've implemented it. Let's think about, what is that one change we want to add in there? What's that one intervention? And then we implement it, we integrate it into the programming. And then it's reflection time, right? Once we've implemented that, it has an impact of some sort on student learning, that piece of reflection, right? Thinking about what's changed in student learning, right? What evidence are we gathering that demonstrate that there has been a change, right? And we're not saying here that every intervention is going to have, only positive impact. Teaching is messy. We should experiment, do things, and see the impact it can have on student learning. But that reflection is really important. And when we care sharing this, right? Nothing more wonderful than taking that conversation to your colleagues. And it doesn't mean, my goodness, now I have to do all of this and publish this as a study. No, you might do something, make small changes. For instance, in your the way you structure your course in an LMS, and then sharing this impact with your colleagues, right, in your department. And of course, we want to emphasize that this is an iterative process, right? That this continues. All these, we want to inspire folks. We want to motivate folks to keep trying different things, and then evaluating, reflecting on the impact of those things. And again, that kind of testing can happen at the micro level, right, within your course, at meso level, right, at the program level, if there are changes made at that level, or institution wide, right? Same kind of approach applies no matter at what level you are doing your inquiry. So we've explored that curriculum change, and there is a Teresa adds into the chat, what you're saying implies collaboration between academic and non-academic stuff, and most universities are not great at encouraging this kind of connection. Absolutely right. Ironically, we just had literally this, when did we have this conversation? My goodness, on Friday, I think we were talking about curriculum design at the University of Toronto, and this sort of connection of faculty working with staff folks on curriculum change in the context of our institution, and this was brought up. So wonderful that you flagged this. Absolutely right. It's got to be intentional, right? Intentionally connecting with folks and treating that as a team sport. Absolutely, absolutely, great point. Thanks for raising that. All right,
And
so
yeah,
sorry, go
I was
ahead,
going to
Sam.
say it connects back to what we said earlier about one of the UDL myth that UDL is only for the classroom, but really it's a collaborative effort across the institution. So the
Mhm.
administrator that sends the orientation email is designing learning as much as the person who is mentoring a student, and just as much as the instructor teaching in front of a classroom, right? So universal design for learning being this intentional approach really works on many levels. And so
Yeah.
for this part of the session, we want to explore the three levels again, and really just introduce different ways of engaging with these levels. So when Mike and I met to talk about the session, we had many different ways to structure it. We can either present three ways of approaching UDL, or we can talk about the three curricular levels, or we talk about like the three assessment design moments. There are so many different ways, but we thought, why don't we offer like an example of how an approach can work together at each level, and sort of give it to each of you as food for thought, as a moment to experiment. So for each of the levels that we're going to talk about, you're going to notice that we'll often flag a link to an open access resource called the Universal Design for Learning Foundations. And there in that OER, it actually unpacks each UDL approach. We're not going to do that here because the session is an hour. And as I know, as generous as you are, we cannot spend the entire rest of the afternoon together. That being said, open email invitation to, hop on the call at any time. So we're going to start at the learning encounter level, the micro level. So we're thinking about those individual courses, the learning encounters, or even the moment the student receives the email saying, welcome to Yorkville University, welcome to the department. So this is a spot where friction becomes most visible. And so the UDL approach that we want to introduce here is called designing dimensions. And the dimensions are methods, materials, and environments. It's almost like taking inventory. We're inviting you to take inventory of a place where you're always getting lots of questions or there's a point of friction. And we're asking you, well, what are the methods? For methods, we're talking about how do we model thinking? How do we structure practice? How do we pose questions? How is feedback delivered? How are we communicating? Right? Materials, a lot of people do feel like they understand materials a bit more. Materials refer to what learners are actually interacting with, either like the LMS, the readings, the cases, the templates, the emails, the many, many emails, the recorded content. Um, Environment is an interesting one. So often when we talk about environments with instructors and staff, they're like, yes, we're thinking about the physical classroom, or yes, we're thinking about our LMS. But what about the social environment? How do we get ready for teamwork? When we tell a student that this is a program where there's lots of collaboration, how do we set up that environment for that collaboration? How do we set up a Zoom space, right? So that social environment is actually one of the richest things. And just this past year, I went to listen to a student group talking about accessibility. And one of the things they said was, the most impactful thing an instructor can do in a class is to schedule a break. I was like, oh, I don't have to design more. I just have to pause, right? And that's a pause in that social environment piece. And that's so impactful, right? So designing dimensions is giving you an opportunity to say, take inventory of that particular moment where you're sensing that tension and brainstorm what are the methodologies associated with it, what are the materials, what are the environments, and what's that one dimension that maybe you want to try making just a slight adjustment to see what happens, right? So and Mike has provided links in the chat to the Universal Design for Learning Foundation, that OER. But on the second slide, we want to give some examples, right? So for methods, if you're thinking like, okay, I want to make a change, maybe I want to model my thinking more when I do my problem sets. Or I want to be very intentional of how I structure guided practice before students work on something by themselves. Or even just clarifying goals. By week 4, we are all going to know exactly the safety procedures, the protocols for this process, right? So being extremely explicit. And yes, many of you will say, I already put this in my syllabus. I know. But methodology, maybe there's a moment where the methodology can not only include the syllabus as material, but a different way of disseminating information. And then for materials, providing templates or exemplars, or just breaking a task down to a couple steps, or removing unnecessary or redundant information. So a good example of this is, I know this for certain instructors, their learning management system on their course site homepage, they have download the syllabus. Then they have a separate page that presents all the information in the syllabus. And then they have a separate pages that then copies and pastes certain sections, subsections of the syllabus. And then when one section needs to be updated, they may forget to update across the board. And students are like, well, which policy do I follow? Is it this or is it this? There's actually 3 different versions, right? And speaking of LMS, environment, organizing the LMS for clarity and flow. Maybe just even having a homepage that could be helpful. Signaling time expectations or time advisory. This task may take 20 minutes or more, or even saying this video is 30 minutes long. That helps your learners then plan their time and say, well, I don't have 30 minutes right now, but now I know I need to budget for that. And then building low stakes practice before high stakes assessment as a way to foster that social environment. And if you're thinking again of like, well, I'm interested in tracking all of this, I want to do a SoTL project. Mike and I have shared some of the questions that could be helpful to get you started thinking on more the SoTL inquiry lens. For example, which of these moves is most underused in your course right now? Maybe you don't use any templates. Is there an opportunity to introduce a template and maybe gather some feedback? What data would help you evaluate a change? Will you rely on course evals? Or will there be assessment wrappers where there's reflection questions that students can fill out after they use a template and submit it? Or maybe you'll track your email. How many students email you with the same questions, right? And then which dimension creates the most friction in your context? I think one of the key things about today is we're not asking to make 17 changes at one time. We're asking pick one, flavor of the month. What would you like to try? And then when you do add something, do you notice a change in your learners? And how are you documenting this? Do you have a reflection journal? Do you have a spreadsheet? Right? So really thinking about these micro changes at the micro level. Maybe usually each term you have 43 emails asking the same questions about like, how do I do this citation style? Next term, you're going to offer a resource or you're going to record a video of you actually typing out a citation. And then you're going to check like, okay, this term, how many emails did I get this time around, right? So those are all moments of inquiry. Just glancing over at the chat to make sure I'm not missing anything right now. At the meso level, when we're starting to think about programs, and sometimes it doesn't even need to be programs. It could be first year course, I don't know, art history 101, and then art history 102. That's not a whole program. That's just two courses. But do they speak to one another, right? And this is more at the meso level of thinking about how courses and programs engage with one another. Or when the student shifts from, say, a minor program into a major program, things like that. So here, one approach is to think about scaffolds. Now, we're not talking about assignment scaffolds where like first you submit a proposal, then you submit an annotated bibliography. No, we're talking about that intellectual scaffolding so that students know first, how do they access information? How do they access the templates? How do they access supports, right? Then what scaffold are there to help them, support them, maintain their engagement at that level? And then finally, the executive function, thinking about how do we help students plan, organize, monitor, modulate, and direct their learning over time so that they rely less and less on you, but they become agentic learners that are resourceful, that can depend on themselves to ask questions and find resources. So again, if we look at examples of what that looked like, access, a big one is orientation. And again, yes, it could be at the course level, but it could be at the program level. Do students know where to go to access different information, to know where they are in the program? Are assessment criteria aligned across various courses? When we say group work, and for one course, do group work kind of mean the same thing when they take the second year level course and the third year level? And if it's different, is it intentional, right? Is it building up to some professional competencies? And is there predictable course structures across program? So that students know that my course will exist on the learning management system, and they won't be confused when the instructor says, well, I don't use the learning management system. So, we're going to hand everything out on paper for the rest of the term. So having conversations around that and thinking about how does it align with the program level outcomes? Because there are sometimes unpredictable structures that's created with the intention of aligning with certain nuances of the program level outcomes. For support, How do feedback practices in courses, across courses, support learners as they navigate through the program? Are there guides and checklists to help students navigate? And are there stable access to key learning resources? How many times have you clicked on the link and it's like, it does not exist, right? And I don't know about you, but I usually just say, oh, well, I guess no help. I'm just going to lie face down on the floor now, right? So ensuring those stable access, and that's not a one-person job. That is a community who is checking in on each other and making sure resources are ready for learners. And then finally, that executive functioning piece. So mapping progression across courses to the program outcomes, making that explicit. I know there are certain professional programs that will say this course actually aligns with these specific program outcomes, right? And then providing tools to track goals and progress and creating clear sequences for skill development so that at the end of the day, the students themselves become a resource for themselves. And again, looping back to our SoTL inquiry, right? Tracking, if we standardize orientation, what changed? Are students accessing the resources? What type of language is now aligned across courses? And do you notice any changes in student performance or student accessing certain types of resources and support? Finally, I know you're all very excited. Meta level. No, sorry, macro. I'm an art historian, so I'm always about meta. I write so much about like this painting is meta. So that's why I said meta. I meant macro. I'm also really regretful I said all of this because I know this is being recorded, but oh well. Macro level. So the macro level, we want to refer back to CAS, the Center for Applied Special Technologies UDL framework. It's a table that provides lots and lots of ideas about how to engage with UDL aligned practices. Now, we really emphasize that this big table, which is kind of like a graphic organizer, which in itself kind of supports the executive functioning of all us designers, is a menu. Just like when you go to Cheesecake Factory, you don't normally order everything off the menu. I mean, you could, but there will be consequences. You pick what you feel like that day, or a pairing of appetizer and dessert and entrees that you enjoy. That's what you can do with the UDL guidelines. You go through it as kind of like an idea generator, and you're like, well, what fits my context right now? So right now, I'm working as a course coordinator for a large bio course. And so I'm not teaching in the classroom, but there are certain things I do engage with students. For example, helping them figure out which tutorials to sign up for and how that aligns with lectures. So maybe I could create like a guide or simple checklist so that students know whether or not they've enrolled in tutorials. Can you tell this is a pain point right now at our institution, the matching up the lectures to tutorials? And so the UDL guidelines is all based on cognitive neuroscience and really is aligned with the why of learning, the what of learning, and the how of learning. So the why being the engagement piece, the what being representation, and then finally the how, the action expression, the way students are demonstrating their learning. And again, we're thinking about specific examples and possible pairings where, for example, let's say your department is really focused on creating that sense of belonging so that students feel they belong in the discipline. They can actually envision themselves as part of this profession. How could that then maybe be paired with something you do from the representation side, maybe adopting and or leveraging the institution-wide accessibility standards, or ensuring multimodal communications in policies and assessments, or for action expression, integrating tools that supports planning and feedback, integrating tools that support planning and feedback from instructors, staff, and students, right? So even breaking that down further. And so when you're looking at this from a SoTL standpoint, you're thinking about, well, what guideline clusters or pairing makes sense for your current design? Maybe you're like, actually, I really like this menu. I want to use it for my course, because here they have something about like clarifying language and symbols. And I teach math, and there's lots of symbols. And that's something I can definitely do in my course, right? So that would be a great moment for you to leverage the UDL guidelines. And in some ways, you're actually creating materials, you're actually designing a dimension of your course. So we've given you more ideas than one can possibly engage with over the past 20 minutes. Mike is going to help you out on how to digest all of it.
So thanks, Sam. So as we promised, it's not trying to do everything all at once. And we've presented sort of three approaches, lots of possibilities, lots of options, a range of different design lenses that you could bring to your teaching. But what we want you to walk away with is trying one thing, right? So having not a plan of like, oh my goodness, I'm going to transform everything in my course, right? Which may be beyond your ability to do that currently. But thinking about that plus or minus one, right? Plus one, adding one option that reduces a barrier, right? We talked about those points of friction, right? Perhaps patterns of confusion, the pinch points. And then minus one, removing one source of overload or unnecessary complexity, right? Or confusion. So again, it could be plus one or minus one, right? And then always, and we keep coming back to this, is that again, that plus or minus one can also become a subtle inquiry, right? So if you bring that sort of inquiry lens into your work, and you think about that cycle of noticing, designing, testing, reflecting, and sharing, then it can easily become a more structured way to sort of reflect on why you want to implement a particular intervention, and then thinking about what impact it's having on student learning, right? So it's like a more structured way to reflect on something that you want to change, something that you want to modify in your course. And so on the next slide, we're going to give you, how much time do we have? Oh my goodness, not a lot of time, but we want to give folks just a quick opportunity to write your plus or minus one, right? Even if it's something change, even if it's something that, something that resonated from the three approaches that we've chatted about in terms of methods, materials, and environments. It could be thinking about the scaffolding of learning, right? That you might want to emphasize in access, supports, and executive function, or it could be through that lens of the design menu through engagement, representation, and action and expression. And we want you to think about that as that small, consistent change with meaningful impact that you want to implement in your course program, or perhaps institution, right? So again, that micro, meso, and macro levels. And if you're stuck, think about that again. Always go back to those friction pinch points, right? In your teaching. What do you repeatedly clarify? As Sam mentioned, if you're getting like 67 emails from students on something, that could possibly be one of those pinch points, right? That you may want to respond to, right? What feels more complex, especially for students, right, than it needs to be, right? So we'll give it just maybe, what time do we have? 12:55. Let's give it like 1 minute just to broadly think about this. We don't have a lot of time, but we just want to create this. And if you're already thinking about that pinch point, do share it in the chat, please. And just to swim back to what Rosalie said, I'm reflecting on who is responsible at that meso level. Absolutely. And who's responsible directly and indirectly, right? Because very often it's like, I feel like I'm responsible indirectly because I work with departments and curriculum review committees, right? So thinking about that direct, perhaps, and indirect, that shared responsibility and how it gets divided. And then Teresa writes, This also enriches society. For example, if we only assess students one way, literature review papers or exams, for example, then who after graduation is going to be the person who develops presentation or invents new methods, etc.? I mean, writing papers only takes a society so far. Someone has to know how to do other things too, and to be appreciated for having the kinds of skills or perspective to process information in alternate ways. Absolutely. Right? If we borrow from Bloom's revised taxonomy, it's all about that top level of creating new things. Absolutely. Right. Wendy writes, excited that I currently can stretch from micro and course redevelopment that will feed into the MESO. Yes, brilliant. And sharing these practices, right, with colleagues who go like, that sounds great. I'm going to actually integrate into my course as well. It's nothing like sharing that in a broader community. I'll just give it another 30 seconds if folks want to share in the chat. Teresa writes, I keep revising my course announcements, kind of like mini FAQs in response to new problems or misunderstanding that students raise that I had not thought of before. Whenever I do this, I tend to get fewer emails and questions. Is this self-interested course development? Absolutely. This is exactly what we're talking about, right? There's like a pinch point, right? And then responding to it, right, in a structured way. Fewer emails that you have to respond to individually. Wendy writes, and always poking the macro pair. Brilliant, love it. Absolutely, right? Bottom up very often, right? We talk about these legacy, we've been teaching this way for 20 or 30 years in our discipline, right? Maybe we change, right? And sometimes that's the bottom up. Absolutely. Rosalie writes, I'm going to redesign how I teach Unit 3 of business course. I take it. It is page for my students. Absolutely. Yes. Brilliant. Love it. Thanks for sharing, folks. Andrew writes, I'm going to use time in class, workshops to scaffold major assignments, step-by-step interaction and feedback. My goodness, that can go a long ways when you have engaged students in a conversation about assignments. Brilliant. Love it. Thanks. Thanks for sharing, everybody. Amazing. So moving forward as we come to the end of our session, moving forward with UDL, right? Universal Design for Learning is a proactive design approach that reduces unnecessary barriers and welcomes learner variability. And again, UDL functions as a structured design inquiry. Use that plus or minus one, right? To build in those small but important meaningful changes and test them, right? Use that subtle cycle to test the impact of those small changes on student learning, right? And always think, and wonderful that folks are already thinking at that all three levels, right? Micro, meso, and macro levels, right? They talk to each other, right? There are always connections between all of these three levels. And thanks everybody for joining us for the Evidence-Informed Curriculum Change conversation with UDL. And of course, our emails are there. Please feel free to reach out to us. We love to engage in conversations about UDL and explore our OER, Universal Design for Learning Foundations. It is an incredible work of Sam's, put together so many amazing ideas. Folks, I truly recommend that you explore this OER. Thanks, everybody. And we're going to stay back, see if there are any questions, if folks want to chat.